I heard that's what they were teaching you all at the Clinton School, and I'm glad I'm getting my hands on you before you're going out in the world. It is one nasty place. It is one nasty place, and it is a world really where power rules, has ruled, still rules. My heroes in this business are not Bismarck or Talleyrand or Henry Kissinger or Sun Tzu or whoever. My hero is Sully Sullenberger. Now, let me tell you why Sully Sullenberger is my hero. His plane was in trouble. The control tower says landed in LAX. Landed in O'Hare Airport. He says, no, I'm going to land it in the Hudson River. That's all I can do. And they say, do this and do that. And he says, well, I can't find that in my tab book. They took out the tabs. But I do know how to land a plane in distress. And lo and behold, he landed it in the Hudson River. And it glided safely to a stop. Everyone was saved, including most of that plane. And Americans reacted, am I making that noise? Americans reacted with enormous pride. This man was taken into our hearts as if he performed a miracle. Well, in many ways it was a miracle. It was the miracle of common sense. And we were applauding, I think, what we once were. We're a nation built on common sense, on pragmatism, on problem solving. What a terrific thing. What a terrific thing that was. And we recognized in him something we had lost. And we lost it particularly in foreign policy, where we seem time after time to get ourselves involved in situations where we fail and where we do no good for the people we're trying to help, no good for ourselves. And to me, the explanation that we've got to search for, the explanation I tried to search for in this book, is why that's happening. And in the first instance, and last, it's about how we think about and use power. Because that's still the currency of international relations. And I mean power in the obvious, practical, common sense way. Power is the ability to get somebody to do something they don't want to do. That's what it is. And that's what international relations is all about. I know we hear all this talk, particularly in academia, and particularly in liberal circles, about soft power, power of persuasion. Well, I defied the author of that book on soft power, Professor Joe Nye at Harvard, to give me one example where soft power ever worked. He couldn't come up with it. Said the end of the Cold War was soft power, not the Cold War I lived through. Persuasion, that's that's built on the idea that we can somehow convince the leader of another country that we understand his interests better than he does. I never saw it happen. Their interests are based on how they see things. And you can really persuade them that you understand it better than he does. It just doesn't happen. It's a tough business, international affairs. It's built on the fact of conflicting interests, on hatreds, on nastiness, on personal political power, and you have to work with that all. And it's more complicated to do it now than ever. Let me run through some of the crises our country is in the midst of at this moment and talk about what we can and can't do in each of them, because that may be the best way of reaching back to understand this central currency of international relations power. Let's look at Korea. Now, North Korea is run by a guy who's a nut, whose main interest in life is watching American porn flicks. If we could get him to stop his nuclear program by providing him with a lifetime supply of those films, I would make a personal donation to that effect. This guy has taken a nation in utter poverty and made it poorer. You can't imagine how the people in that country live. And they're completely blocked from the outside world. They really can control everything going on inside that country. And they have a nuclear capability. Now, George Bush, for 8 years, threatened those people. Said, you go ahead and have another nuclear test, you'll be sorry. Well, it's unacceptable. We won't tolerate it. And what did he do? He tolerated it and he accepted it. It's the single dumbest thing you can do with American power. Say you're going to do something and not do it. Power is about being taken seriously. If you make threats you don't keep, you lose power. Now, why don't we go and blow the little emperor there to kingdom come? Why don't we do it? We have all sorts of Americans saying, let's go bomb the hell out of those guys before they develop a real nuclear capability. Well, I'll tell you why. And most of the people who say go bomb the hell out of them know these facts I'm about to tell you just as well as I do, but they go say it anyway. The fact of the matter is North Korea has 12,000 artillery pieces and rockets sitting right on the border with South Korea. They're all aimed at the Seoul area. If we went after the North to deal with the nuclear problem, they would completely destroy the top third of South Korea. So guess what? Guess what? The South Koreans don't want us to go blow up the North because they're going to get blown up in the process. The biggest restraint on our attacking the North is the South. We get rid of the North, we're going to get rid of most of the South too. So there's a standoff. That's the reality of it. We can talk in American politics all we want, but our power to get them to stop that nuclear program tomorrow, next month, is zero. Because we can't enforce it militarily, and we haven't been able to figure out how to keep them bribed. President Clinton tried, made a very smart effort at doing so. Even Bush, at the end of his administration, made a deal with them. They didn't keep it, we didn't keep it, and we're sort of back to square one now. Let's look at Iran. Iran is moving toward a nuclear capability. And my bet is they're lying about it. They say they're doing this only for peaceful purposes, and they cite the fact, and it is a fact, that under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a treaty that we pushed on the rest of the world, really an American drawn-up treaty, under that treaty, to which they are a signatory, they are fully allowed to have this uranium enrichment capability. Fully allowed, subject to international inspection. If they allow international inspectors, they can do everything they're doing. And yet, we have passed the UN resolution under our leadership that says they can't do it. And they say, go to hell. And what do we say? We're going to do more and more economic sanctions against you. Well, can we? Not without the cooperation of Russia and China. So what does Obama do? Obama gets into office and he says, September is going to be the deadline, you Iranians. Either you stop this uranium enrichment program by September or else. Just follow all that Bush stuff he had himself criticized. And guess what? It passed and there was no or else. Obama made a very reasonable proposal recently that Iran first seemed to accept and now seems to reject. But there are no economic sanctions that we can impose effectively without the cooperation of Russia and China, particularly Russia. So you don't make those threats unless you can keep them. And you've got to go to the Russians first and work out some sort of deal to get them on board for further sanctions, if you have any hope of the sanctions working. And if the Russians aren't prepared to do that now, you don't make idle threats. At the least, you go to Moscow and you say, look, we know you are as interested as we in not having Iran with a full nuclear capability. You have different ways and interests in how to get there. But for the time being, we ask you not to say anything at all. Don't say you're with us on the sanctions. Don't say you're against us on the sanctions. Just be quiet. And then we have to wait. And we have to wait until things change inside Iran. Because the solution of going there and attacking them is about the dumbest thing of all the dumb things I've heard of in my whole career in foreign policy. We go attack Iran, where we're not even sure where all these uranium enrichment facilities are. We wouldn't knock them all out. They're sure to respond with terrorist attacks against us all over the world. And for what? 2 years later, they're going to be back to where they are now, or further along in a nuclear capability. We have to wait for the situation to ripen within Iran, and I think it will. Why do I think it will? Because there are so many people in that country who want to reconnect with the world, and particularly with us. Just give you one fact that, to me, showed where Iran was going to go if we'd let it go there. When 9/11 occurred, in every single country in the Muslim world, people flocked into the streets to cheer. They were just delighted we got attacked. There was one exception, Iran. Millions of people went into the streets all throughout Iran in sympathy with the United States. Just think about it. You saw the effect of some of that in the last elections. There's this feeling there, and they will take care of it. They don't want us to take care of it. They don't want us to take care of it. It's something Americans just can't get in our heads. I met a few months ago with a group of about 30 young Iranians, people who were working in democracy groups, human rights groups, newspapers, and the group also included 3 or 4 aspiring young mullahs. It was an absolutely fascinating group. And they all agreed on one thing. The single worst thing the United States did for those in Iran who wanted to change the situation was when Congress passed that legislation to provide $58 million to promote democracy and human rights in Iran. They said, what happened? They closed down all the newspapers. They closed down our organizations. You made us into co-conspirators with you. It didn't help us one bit. It hurt us. Let us take care of it. We also have to realize that it's not only the bad Iranians who want to continue with this uranium enrichment capability. It's the Iranians we applaud. Our new hero in Iran is the guy who lost the election to Ahmadinejad, Mousavi, former prime minister of that country. He's our new hero. He wants the uranium enrichment capability for Iran. I don't know an Iranian opposed to it. They say, we signed the treaty, we can have it. They say, our friends as well as our enemies in Iran, what the devil are you talking about, our having no uranium enrichment capability? North Korea has nuclear weapons, and you were making an economic cooperation deal with North Korea, both Clinton and Bush. India has nuclear capability. You're now providing more trade with India than you ever did before, and you've exempted their nuclear facilities from international inspection. What kind of business is that? And you yourself say Pakistan is the most dangerous country in the world because it could be taken over by extremism, and they have nuclear weapons, and you're worried about us, and on top of it, Israel has nuclear weapons. So I know as hard as it is for us to understand, as totally unreasonable as the situation is, they have a different point of view than we do. It's astonishing. Those dumb people. You have to wait for the situation inside to ripen. Even Mousavi opposes further economic sanctions by the U.S. against Iran. Said so publicly recently several times. So without that kind of internal support, you have to wait for the situation to ripen. The use of power in another country is something hard for Americans to understand because we live by a myth. And the myth is we shouldn't interfere in the domestic politics of other countries and they shouldn't interfere in our domestic politics. What nonsense. You can't have foreign policy without interfering in the domestic politics of another country. That's what it is. You're trying to affect the decisions in that other country. How do you do it? By the Lord descending from the ceiling and convincing them to change their minds? You do it by interfering. And you do the interference by letting people inside that society whose interests more coincide with yours. You give them the goodies to make their case. If you have to make the case, it doesn't work. Everybody unites against you. You're all pressuring us, lecturing us. You give them the goodies, they'll make the case. They have the interests. Take a look at Iraq. In Iraq, everyone says, you know, the surge worked. Well, the surge did help. There's no question about it. Military surge, additional U.S. forces. But what really worked is that after 4 years of fighting the Sunni Arabs in the center of Iraq, who were the main ones killing us, but they were also the main ones being killed by the ones who were more extreme than they were, which established a common interest between them and us, which Bush refused to act on. When he finally let our people in Baghdad talk to the Sunni leaders and make a deal. We'll arm you, we'll supply you, we'll back you, we'll send more forces to your area if you fight on our side. That was the biggest turnaround in the Iraq War, the alliance with the Sunnis. We could have sent 300,000 more troops there. It wouldn't have made the difference that having the Sunnis as allies made. On top of it, Muqtada Sadr, the Shiite militia leader, backed off on fighting us in the cities for reasons we still don't quite understand. And then miracle upon miracles, the Prime Minister, Maliki, turned out to be a strong man instead of a jerk. Some of you may remember that as Bush was heading off to Jordan to meet with Maliki, the White House leaked a memo by Bush's National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley, saying Maliki's a jerk, he's hopeless, you know, we've got no alternative, and we can't deal with this guy, he is beyond our help. A few months later, Maliki turns into the strongman of Iraq. No one I knew predicted it, especially the surgists. It just wasn't on their radar at all. Let's go to the Middle East, and I'm going to pick up Afghanistan. The Middle East, the United States had started off in this administration urging the Israelis to stop all settlement activity in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And then sitting down at the table with the Palestinians. Nobody I knew with any experience in those negotiations over the years would have told you that would work. There's no chance it would work. The Israelis weren't about to give up their main bargaining chip, those settlements, in return for simply sitting down at the table with the Palestinians. Now you can talk about all the rights and wrongs you want, but that's what international relations is. No state is going to give up its bargaining chips in return for just a promise to talk. And finally, the Obama administration realizes this, has to change its position. And now we're in a whole mess of trouble with the Arabs because of it. Now, how do you deal with that with your power? Well, we've been trying for decades now to get the Palestinians and the Israelis to the table and agree. But the fact of the matter is, their leaders don't have much political incentive to agree because in their societies, there isn't much support for compromise. There was in Israel at the end of the Clinton administration, when the Israeli Prime Minister, in effect, said he was prepared to give back 97% of the West Bank. But when Arafat rejected that proposal, Israeli society became radicalized too. So there's very little support in either community now for a deal, for compromise. So the leaders don't make the compromises. And they don't want to go out and argue for the compromises. There isn't too much political support in that either. That's the reality of it. So it was a reality that the British faced in Northern Ireland. For 10 years, they kept pushing the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants to sit down at the negotiating table. Guess what happened? They failed every time. And after every failure, the societies became more radicalized. They said, we can't agree. They killed each other more. Finally, the Brits got smart, and instead of pressing them to sit down with each other at the table to disagree once again, they started to work on developing groups among the Catholics and the Protestants to work together. They promoted joint business operations, and they promoted joint women's groups, and it took 2 to 3 years, and they had a constituency for compromise and for peace, and they made the deals finally. That's what we have to bring to the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's how we have to use our power. What about Afghanistan? I'm going to cut this a bit short, and you may want to talk more in the Q&A period about it. But to me, Afghanistan is the perfect example of Americans failing to understand what our whole history the last 50 years shows, that the way to win these internal civil wars, the only way to win them, is if the people we're trying to help are willing to help themselves, fix up their own government, and do the fighting. When they're willing to do that, boy, can we do a lot of good. When they're not willing to do that, in the end, all we can do is put in more and more American troops to prevent defeat. Now, as long as we have a lot of American troops in a country like Afghanistan, no one is going to beat us. They have the skill and the firepower to prevent defeat. You can't imagine the terror they can wreak. But they can prevent defeat. They can't win. Only the people we're trying to help can win. This strategy that our military keeps pushing, a strategy Obama himself endorsed for the first 6 months of his administration. His strategy was counterinsurgency. What was counterinsurgency? Counterinsurgency is part providing military security, but the larger part is nation building. And how are we going to build that nation? They can't even hold the semblance of a fair election. The administration there is totally corrupt. The president's brother is one of the biggest drug dealers, and he's also on the CIA payroll. You show me how smart we are to have figured that one out. And we do it in country after country, by the way. The same deal. And as soon as you're into that double and triple dealing, you know we're doing the wrong thing in the wrong place. Common sense just tells you that. Sadly, when you fight a war for 8 years already, you develop interest even from your mistakes. So you just can't walk away from the place. And I think we will see now President Obama emphasizing the training and responsibility of the friendly Afghans and limiting the number of additional American troops there. And that's a good thing. But it will work only if Obama realizes who we are. That is, we aren't the kind of country that really likes to train these people. We want to do it ourselves. Our guys want to do the fighting. They don't trust the friendly Afghans to do the fighting. So training them has to be really ordered and pushed hard and followed up from the top. We've got to make sure it happens. I'll tell you something that may shock you. We didn't even send in professional military trainers to Afghanistan until 2 months ago. A battalion of the 82nd Airborne trained trainers went in there. Until then, we had part-time National Guardsmen doing it. That's how ridiculous it was. Now we've got to do it in a determined and focused way. And if we don't, we'll be there just in an open-ended way until Americans get so fed up that we'll have to withdraw the troops in the kind of precipitous way I think it's important to avoid. Now, why is it we make these mistakes? Why do we do this stuff? Why did John Foster Dulles spark rebellions in Hungary and East Germany when he knew we weren't going to come to the aid of those rebelling and that the Soviets would crush the rebellion? Why did he do that? Why has the United States, for 40-some-odd years, not done something about its dependence on Middle East oil? 1973, we had the Arab oil boycott. And it was clear from that moment on that unless we reduced our dependence on Middle East oil, we'd be fighting wars in that part of the world forever. Why didn't we do something about it? Taxes. No more taxes. No new taxes. In order to do it, you have to spend money. You have to increase taxes. We'd rather send people out to fight wars and get killed and spend even more money than we would on raising taxes. But we weren't going to raise taxes. Why does Kennedy approve the Bay of Pigs invasion and provide no support? Why we get involved in Iraq? What's going on? Well, in part of the explanation is that Americans just don't like that word power, don't like to think about that word power. They like to think rather of leadership and persuasion and sweet reason. And the other is we've got some demons to deal with. Power is not soft or hard. Power is power, what I talked about. It's getting somebody to do something they don't want to do based on the resources you can give or deny, based on your international position, how people need you in their area of the world to get certain things done, and your skill in using all this. Soft power, persuasion. I like to try persuasion because it's good for the climate, convinces people you're trying to be reasonable, but by itself, it's only foreplay. It's not the real thing. Hard power, military force, is a physical act. And power is a psychological relationship. Military force is something you use when your power fails. But Americans, we think almost solely in terms of the soft power, persuasion, and the hard power, military force and threats. Not that narrow band of psychological power and relationships where things really do or don't get done in the world. Power, the world isn't flat in terms of power. That's another one of the current fashions. It's all been sort of equalized, you know, everybody has a little slice of the pie, and America is just another one of them. It's nonsense. You can't talk to any world leaders who would support that point of view. Power is still highly pyramidal. The United States is on top. You have a group of about 8 countries underneath, like Russia, China, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, India, Brazil. I failed to mention Canada, and one of the reviewers for the New York Times focused his whole review on that. If I could only write my book again and mention Canada. It's highly pyramidal, and we're still at the top alone. This is not the post-American era in power. We're still the world's only leader. And if you ask any leader of another country, they'll tell you the same thing, including especially the Chinese. Because world leadership requires sacrifice, requires resources and sacrifice. For all our economic woes, and boy, we have something to worry about on that front, I'll get to in a moment. For all our economic woes, we still have far more resources than any other country. China's not anywhere near us, even yet. So we remain the sole power in the world capable of global leadership. No other country can deploy force around the world. No other country can come close to it. No other country still has our economic resources, and none has our positioning. The countries of Asia still want us there as a balance to China. The countries of the Middle East still want us there as a balance to Iran. But we haven't got the power to do things on our own anymore. Also hard for Americans to understand. We can't order other countries around. We're the indispensable leader, but we need equally indispensable partners to get things done. As I said, in the case of Iran, we want to ratchet up the economic sanctions. You need Russia. You want to be able to put more military pressure on North Korea. You can't do it without South Korea. You need partners in every one of these cases. We're the indispensable leader. They're equally indispensable partners. It is a power situation of mutual indispensability that Americans don't feel comfortable about, because we have to get others to agree to us. And how do you get them to agree? You get them to agree by committing the ultimate sin: compromise. Compromise. That's one of the dirtiest words in the American language. But you can't exercise the power under the principle of mutual responsibility without compromising to get the necessary partners. We also have to deal with our demons, because the demons get us into trouble time and again. And the demons come from what's really good about us. There are three demons. One is the demon of principle. You know, it's not fashionable to say this either, but the fact of the matter is America is one of the few countries in the world that actually believe in principles, actually wants to go help other countries, is prepared to make sacrifices, substantial ones, to help them. We really want other countries to enjoy the blessings of democracy and free market. We do. But from principle also comes blindness. Because we're so determined to do it, we forget the material we're dealing with. That other countries have histories, culture, their own way of life, their own internal hatreds that just can't be overcome by our principles. Others don't embrace our principles the way we do. And look how long it took for us to become perfect the way we are today. It took a few years before we became perfect. But we put it aside because that thrust on principles, beliefs, so strong. I find it particularly among younger people, and particularly among our younger people serving in the armed forces. They're willing to sacrifice their lives for these principles. Second thing is domestic politics. Now that pressures us into all these terrible situations because nobody wants to look weak. But that domestic political situation arises because we are a democracy. We want to give full play to all the interests, all the points of view. That's our tradition. But the price we pay for it is that we're pushed into wars because presidents don't want to look weak against the U.S. internal opposition. And finally, we have this can-do spirit, which I love, which is so much a part of what made us a terrific nation, successful nation, which turns into, in the international world, which turns into an arrogance of power. The belief is if we only make up our minds, only have the will and determination, we can get anything done, make anything happen. But it just ain't so. It wasn't so, and it ain't so. Even our memories of the past fail us when it comes to our ability to order other nations around. And it's even harder today because you have so many nations. You know, when the United Nations was formed, there were 47 countries. Now you have almost 200, plus all these NGOs that want to do good, and international business, now more of a role than ever before. It's much more complicated, much more difficult. And instead of having the Maharaja to kick around in some country, you know, we could tell the Maharaja, you do what we say or else you're not going to Maharaj anymore. You'll have to go to Oxford and study for a few years. They have nations, and these nations are better able to resist. So the application of power is much more difficult than before. We have to wait for situations to ripen. We have to lean on others more than get involved in wars and internal civil strife. Presidents Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower understood that very well. They faced a strategic situation in the world, I think, actually quite similar to the one we're facing today. And I think the answer they gave for our country then still holds as the right answer today. You'll remember at the end of World War II, we demobilized very quickly. The Soviet Union kept all its men under arms, 5 million plus men under arms. They took over Eastern Europe. They were right in the heart of Europe. Mao Zedong was taking over China. And there were cries within our country to remobilize and go get them. You know, we had the atomic bomb. Let's go get them. This was the time to do it. Instead, President Truman, and Eisenhower followed the same course later on, President Truman, General Marshall, Dean Acheson adopted a very different course. They didn't remobilize. They didn't spend America's limited resources on huge armaments buildup. You know, today, the United States defense budget is larger than the entire defense spending in the rest of the world. We spend more than the rest of the world put together on arms and armaments and men under arms. You think about that. They weren't going to do that. Instead, they kept a modest military capability, still quite strong, but modest, and they concentrated on two things. One, they concentrated on building up our good friends and allies in Western Europe and Japan. And they reasoned that if we did that, if we made them economically strong again, they would become politically stable, and we would have strong allies. And that's what happened. And that's where the will to resist communism came from. These societies solving their problems and becoming healthy and wealthy again. In fact, when you put together the military, economic, and diplomatic resources of Western Europe, Japan, and the United States, we had 80% of those resources in the entire world. And it meant we could actually afford stupid mistakes vis-a-vis the Soviet Union because we had so much to fall back on. We had made really strong allies out of countries ready to take those steps. The second thing Truman and Eisenhower did was to focus on the American economy, because they understood that all this smoke and mirrors and hotbed talk about going to war and smashing our enemies was not the basis of American power in the world. That the basis of American power was our economy. They were quite explicit about this. That we counted in the world primarily because we had such a powerful economy, an economy that could produce the best military in the world, an economy that could help or harm others wanting to play in the international economic arena. And they realized as well that that economy was the basis of our democracy, that as long as it provided hope and opportunity, Americans could cohere when they needed to cohere. So they made that strategic choice. I think that our leaders today have to make the same choice. This is not a plea for isolationism. I'm the opposite of an isolationist. It's just to say where your priorities have to be. And our priorities have to be on repairing our nation. We have a public school system that doesn't function. It's the basis of our economy and our democracy. And we have an economy where the students graduating from this place can expect almost 50% less earnings throughout the course of their lives than the previous generation. And where the poor will be even poorer. We can't allow that to happen. It will change us. And it will certainly change our ability to deal with problems in the world. And if we aren't the leader in dealing with world problems, there is no world leader. And those problems will fester and beyond anything we've experienced. How do you deal with those demons that are preventing us from applying this common sense? Well, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you with the answer, because the answer is with moderation and common sense. Moderates, by definition, don't fight. You know, moderates, they try to see one point of view and the other point of view, and a lot of Americans, fortunately, are moderate. But what has happened increasingly in American society, particularly as it relates to foreign policy, but in other areas as well, what's happened increasingly in our society is that the extremists take over every one of these debates. On the foreign policy side, they want to do the persuasion. Oh, let's sit and talk to the Israelis and the Palestinians and sweet reason, and with the Iranians, these people who just hate each other and hate us. And people who say, let's go to war. Oh, let's threaten it. They take over the debates. The moderates have to fight back. And America is worth fighting for. Good to talk with you.
We do have time for some quick questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you in the back.
To what extent can trade with countries that the United States is not that friendly with, like China, help the United States increase and use its power in those countries?
Yeah, well, in the case of China, let me go back. Interesting you bring up trade. I was going to mention it, but once I start talking, I get so passionate about my argument I can't stop. So I had to cut things off somewhere. I was going to mention global warming and trade as perfect examples of where, to be a world leader, you have to make sacrifices. If you look at every past free trade agreement, international free trade agreement, those agreements, every one of them, were triggered by major American concessions. I know this runs contrary to the usual public baloney that we tell ourselves, but they were all made possible by big American concessions. And then others made their concessions. But nothing happened until that first happened, until we started the ball rolling. Now, why did we feel prepared to make the disproportionate concessions? It's because we felt we were strong enough as an economy so that in the long run, and even in the shorter run, we would be the main beneficiaries. If we could open things up to real competition, we'd do better than the others. We had that confidence. And it worked out. That's exactly what happened. Others got bigger and better, but so did we. In the case of global warming today, Copenhagen isn't going to get anywhere because we aren't in a position to take the lead in making economic sacrifices for global warming. We're having such internal economic woes ourselves. And American economic recovery will have to precede real progress on global warming too. No other major power is prepared for such sacrifice. Not a chance. In the case of our relationship with China, it's like in the Cold War relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, mutual assured destruction. We are now so intertwined that the mutual dependency is such that it's hard for us to do crazy things to hurt the other guy without also hurting ourselves. China is the major beneficiary on trade today. I believe that will change and should change over the next 5 years or so if China allows a reasonable evaluation of the yuan or the renminbi, to value it higher than it is today, to make their products somewhat less competitive and our products somewhat more competitive, in line with the economic realities in the world today. Once that happens, the relationship will begin to equalize somewhat. But they still hold $1 trillion in American debt. That makes them our master and our servant. You know the old line that financiers use. They say if you owe somebody $100, you're in his debt. If you owe somebody $1 million, they're in your debt. You've got to succeed.
Right there? Hold on one second. Wait for... Hold on one second. She's coming.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Thank you. I just very much appreciate your breaking down all the aspects of power and how we use it or fail to use it. But as I was listening, I looked at what I understand about Israel and the Palestinian territories. And when I look at the test of power, we certainly have the power. We do have the power. We don't. We have the power. We could pull some of the financing of weapons. Certainly, we have backed a series of often corrupt governments, and that hasn't endeared us to, you know, some of the other countries in the area. And we also don't have, I mean, we haven't been able to rally partners to our cause. How do we change that? How do we change the dynamics when the things that we have used with other countries, we don't apply there?
Yeah, I think you're right in most of what you say. How do you change it? I think I was suggesting a way to change it. You can't change it by forcing them to the negotiating table and by our threatening to hit the Israelis over the head. It's not going to happen. When the moment is ripe for compromise, the United States will pressure Israel. We have on every previous occasion where it's mattered. The Camp David Accords, it was the U.S. wringing the concessions out of the Israelis. The Sinai Agreement, which gave back the Sinai to Egypt, American pressure. On this, we will, and President Clinton, the end of his administration, the Camp David and Taba agreements, 97% of the West Bank back to the Palestinians. So it's not as if the United States, when it seemed appropriate and timely, wasn't prepared to squeeze the Israelis. We were. But that's the time we should do it. And we're not near that point yet. Now, it's easy in the Arab world to complain about us. But the truth of the matter is the moderate Arab leaders, and I use the word moderate humorously, like Mubarak and the Saudis, they understand full well that if there's going to be a deal there, it's going to be brokered by the United States. And yet they attack us too. They ought to spend their time working with the Palestinians to promote compromise on that end. You know, to the very end, Arafat was promising, and he was obliged to do this by the Camp David Accords, to take out of the PLO charter the call for the destruction of the State of Israel. He never did. It's still there today. And the Israelis look at that and say, if they're not willing to go to their own people and remove that kind of statement, it's too risky to make the compromises. We can't trust them. And you're talking about a people here whose nation was born in a Holocaust. And boy, that's in their heads every bit as strongly as all our principles are in our heads. And it's in their heads every bit as strongly as the Palestinian feelings that they have rights on the West Bank. And all of that has to be dealt with. Israel is a democracy, unlike those other countries. It is a democracy. We have that common interest. We share the moral interest with them and their creation, and we have other national interests in the area as the one reliable ally we have in that part of the world. And that means we're going to take their interest into account in how we behave. A lot of American liberals don't like this at all, and the Arabs don't like it at all, but it is the reality of things. And the other reality is, when they are prepared to make compromises, we will see that Israel makes comparable compromises. That will happen.
We have time for just one more question.
Thank you for being Mr. Gelb, and thank you for your inspiring speech. I'm Dewi. I'm from Indonesia. I'm a Clinton School student. I have a question. How do you see some of the inconsistencies of U.S. foreign policy, or borrowing your word as a power, to create peace and not war? Because I see that some inconsistency that I really concerned that United States is the only country, as far as I know, that hasn't got intention to sign Protocol Kyoto, for instance.
Sign?
Protocol Kyoto
Yes.
Protocol.
Yes.
So how do you see that the approach of the world, like imposing on Iran on the nuclear, but not really imposing to Israel on nuclear? So how do you see that it can create more peace? Because I see that as could create more war than peace.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, as I said, we do some awfully dumb things that I disagree with. We were the ones who promoted the Kyoto protocols. It was the invention of Clinton and Gore. And then we didn't sign the agreement. Why? It's because 1/3 of America thought signing the Kyoto protocols would cause syphilis. We have a bizarre country. I'm joking about that, but in a way it's true. They had these crazy ideas that that global warming is an invention of nutty liberal scientists that they're trying to foist on America so that the communists and terrorists can take over the world. And once anybody assumes that level of intellectual argument, it's better to go home. You got to wait till somebody else is in power. Obama, I believe, wants to do something on this front, but as I said, we're restrained from doing so because of our economic situation. We've got to make the key compromises, and as a practical matter, we can't. We're already facing an unprecedented federal deficit, and this would be substantially more. It'll have to wait. I wish it didn't, but it'll have to wait. And as far as promoting peace, I see most members of the United Nations promoting malarkey. You know what that means? It's a nice word for bullshit. They vote for things because it looks good, but they never put their money or their lives or their countries behind it. It's a vote for show. And when it comes to deliver, most of them just don't deliver. They take positions to please one another. The level of corruption in so many of these societies, the treatment of their own people, is so horrendous that it's hard for me to take them seriously as partners. I want to treat them seriously. I want to help them get to the next stage. but the way they handle their own country, their own peoples, is not inspiring of my confidence.